Okay, hello and welcome to this webinar on the new review standard for reviewing service performance information, NZ SRE 1. And my name is Lisa Thomas and I'm a Senior Project Manager at the Assurance and Audit team at the External Reporting Board. And today I'm being joined by my fantastic colleague Bruce McNiffin, who's also in the Assurance and Audit team at the External Reporting Board. So today we're going to talk about the new review standard and take you through why we've issued a new standard, some of the key benefits of the new standard, and then we'll take you through the different stages of an engagement of review of service performance information. And along the way, we'll highlight some of the key differences between an audit and a review of service performance information. And then lastly, we'll look at next steps of how to prepare for the new standard. So before we take you through the new standard, I thought I'd briefly touch on what is it when we mean service performance information. So service performance reporting is reported by public benefit entities who are required to follow the External Reporting Board accounting standards. And it requires an entity to provide information about why the entity exists, what it broadly intends to achieve over the medium to long term, and how it goes about this, and then information about what it has done during the period and working towards those broader aims and objectives. So assurance practitioners have been undertaking reviews of service performance information using these two documents on your screen. So the first one is ISAE New Zealand 3000 Revised, which is a mouthful, but it is the assurance standard for non-financial information. And EGAU 9, which is a guidance document on the audit or review of a performance report for Tier 3 entities or not-for-profits. So essentially that is a guide on how to apply 3000 to performance reports. However, the XRB has now issued a new review standard that's specifically for the review of service performance information. It's NZ SRE 1 and it is applicable for accounting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2026. And at which time ISAE New Zealand 3000 Revised will no longer be applicable for service performance information, and EGAU 9, the guidance document, will be withdrawn. So alongside the standard, we've also issued an explanation for decisions made, and this takes you through the decisions that we made in finalising NZ SRE 1 following the consultation of the exposure draft. And this can be found on our website where you find the standard, but I've popped the links here on the screen for you to help you find those. So why did we issue a new standard? Well, in New Zealand, and under the Charities Act, there is an option for Tier 3 charities with operating expenditure between 550k and 1.1 million to have either an audit or a review of their performance report. And this performance report contains both financial and service performance information. The review standards issued by the External Reporting Board, they address the historical financial information. However, there was no review standard that specifically addressed the service performance information. So due to the statutory requirement, when we scoped NZRS 1, we did it for Tier 3 charities in mind. So when deciding what to include or exclude, for example, from the standard, we considered what an insurance practitioner would need for these types of engagements. Excuse me. So what are some of the key benefits of this new standard? Well, firstly, it has an integrated approach. And what I mean by that is it's applied concurrently with the review standard for historical financial information. And that's because these types of engagements should be approached as one engagement over the entire performance report. It is specific to service performance information. So we thought about when developing the standard, what is particularly relevant to service performance information? Or perhaps due to the nature of service performance information, it may require a different approach by the practitioner that they may take when reviewing financial information. So a good example of this is materiality, and this is an area Bruce will take you through later on in the webinar. And some of you out there may be aware that we've actually recently revised the auditing standard for service performance information. So we've also applied some of the lessons we learned from that, and we've aligned language and concepts. So this is a high-level look at these key benefits, but we'll provide you with more detail as we carry on going through. So it's important to note that a key focus in developing the standard was to ensure that the requirements are suitable for a limited assurance engagement. And we gave a lot of thought, right from planning through to reporting, whether we've got that balance right for a limited assurance engagement. So when developing the standard, we considered the work effort for a review and how that may differ to an audited service performance information. And we're really mindful of the need to be able to assist the assurance practitioner to understand what they need to do differently and to be clear that this is a limited assurance engagement. When the work effort was similar to an audit, what we've done is we've adapted the requirements from the NZAS1 revised to promote consistency between the two assurance standards. So we compared and contrasted each stage of the review engagement in the context of a service performance information to an audit of service performance information. And you can see here on the screens, these are our observations summarised in the table. But it's really important to keep in mind that it is actually a matter of professional judgment as to how to meet the objective of a limited assurance. It depends on the context of the engagement and what comes to the attention of the assurance practitioner throughout the engagement. So let's look at these stages now. So the first one here is understanding the assurance. What understanding does the assurance practitioner need to obtain when doing a review? So those of you who do audits of service performance information may have noticed there's similarity in the review standard to NZAS1 revised in the areas of understanding the entity, which is why the entity exists, what activities it services it does, who it aims to serve, for example, its laws and regulations, and the service performance information reported. So this is the process around the understanding the process that the entity undertook in developing their service performance information, the users they identified, the measurement bases they've used and considered along the way. We felt that the assurance practitioner would need the same breadth and depth of understanding in these areas for a review of service performance information as you would an audit. Because obtaining an understanding of the entity is a really important step when reviewing service performance information. And it's particularly to enable the assurance practitioner to do an assessment of whether the information presented by the entity is appropriate and meaningful. We thought it may be simpler for a Tier 3 entity, but you still need that same understanding, and it is just as important. When we come to an understanding of the internal controls, you'll see that we've actually aligned that with the requirements of the review standard for historical financial information, SRE New Zealand 2400. And it requires an understanding of the internal controls over the preparation of service performance information. You're not expected to have the same depth as you would for an audit, and it may, for example, be inquired through inquiry. But it's still important to obtain this knowledge to help you identify whether risks are likely to result in a material misstatement. So moving on to planning. I won't spend too much time here, but planning is another area where the requirements are similar to an audit. So paragraph 20 requires you to develop a review plan to concurrently cover the service performance information and the financial information. And this is to reflect the integrated nature of the engagement and recognises the link between the service performance information and the financial statements of the entity. Planning will also include things such as discussions with management or those charged with governance about the service performance information the entity intends on reporting, the timing of when you're going to assess whether the information is appropriate and meaningful, whether an expert may be needed, and directing the team's efforts. So I was saying earlier that we applied some of the lessons that we've learned from when we revised the auditing standard. And this is one of those key areas where we have aligned the review standard with the auditing standard, in that the review standard includes a two-step approach to reviewing service performance information. So what I mean by that is step one is where life starts to differ a bit from a review of financial information. And that firstly, the assurance practitioner needs to determine whether anything has come to their attention that the service performance information does not present fairly in all material respects, quite a mouthful, and that the what has been reported is not appropriate and meaningful. This requires the assurance practitioner to have a really good understanding of the entity in order to apply their professional judgment in making this assessment. So before diving into that step two, the assurance practitioner needs to think about what has been reported and does that align with their understanding of the entity and what is important to users. Having completed this first step, then the assurance practitioner then assesses whether anything has come to their attention that the information doesn't fairly reflect the actual service performance information of the entity and is not materially misstated. So this is a step that's probably more familiar to those of you who have done reviews of financial information. So let's take a closer look at these two steps. So I've mentioned this term appropriate and meaningful now probably a couple of times. So what do I mean by that? So the term appropriate and meaningful in step one isn't defined in the review standard, as that has come from the financial reporting framework. And the applicable financial reporting framework requires the entity to report service performance information that is appropriate and meaningful through applying the qualitative characteristics, which I've popped up here on the screen for you, and balancing the pervasive constraints of materiality and cost benefit to result in appropriate and meaningful service performance information. So service reporting requirements, they are less prescribed than financial information, in that the reporting requirements enable the organisation to determine how it selects, aggregates, measures, and presents its service performance information. So this can result in varied service performance information even between, say, similar entities in similar industries. And it's for this reason that both the audit and review standards both require this two-step approach to assure service performance information. So NZSRE1 takes the assurance practitioner through a number of factors when considering if the information is appropriate and meaningful. And so some of the examples of these factors include whether it relates to an element or aspect of the service performance information that contributes significantly to the core purpose of the entity. So an example I thought of for this is, say there's a measure for an event that was held. How does that event relate to the entity's purpose? And whether it is likely to meet the needs of the intended users to make an informed assessment of the service performance of the entity. And does it present, say, a neutral view, including both positive and negative aspects of their performance? An example may be if there's disclosures of, say, survey results, how are the disclosure of those survey results selected? How did they decide which ones to report? Is the service performance information report complete, or is it overly voluminous? So it's just lots of clutter and things get lost that are important. And were the intended users, say, involved in the process to determine what service information to report? To recognise the different work effort, though, of a review engagement, NZSRE1 requires the practitioner to only need to consider these factors when assessing whether the information is appropriate and meaningful. As opposed to an audit, they're required to evaluate these factors. Following feedback that we got from the consultation, people said it wasn't clear what this would look like in practice. So for the final standard, we've included an example of how these two things may look different. So it's really important because the assurance practitioner may benefit from early engagement with the entity to understand the entity's service performance reporting process and what it intends to report, and discuss any issues that may arise and whether the information is appropriate and meaningful. It's important to have this early engagement because it'd be difficult, say, to get to the end of the financial reporting period and for the assurance practitioner to, say, disagree with the information reported. So having this discussion early, as you can imagine, would be best. The assessment of whether the information is appropriate and meaningful requires a lot of professional judgment, and therefore it is important that the insurance practitioner has a really deep understanding of the entity in order to exercise this professional judgment. So now I'll hand you over to Bruce, who's going to take you through step 2 of this approach.
Thanks, Lisa. So as Lisa discussed earlier, the reporting requirements enable an organisation to determine how it measures its service performance. Therefore, the assurance practitioner needs to determine whether anything comes to their attention that the service performance information hasn't been prepared in accordance with those measurement bases or evaluation methods selected by the entity, and in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. Now, like step 1, there might be some differences in step 2 compared to a financial statement review. For example, the systems may not be traditional or as mature as financial reporting systems, or the sources of evidence may be different due to the nature of service performance, which may require the assurance practitioner to think a bit differently to obtain that relevant and reliable evidence. Now let's take a look at materiality. So this is an area that requires the assurance practitioner to exercise significant professional judgment when assuring service performance information. This area is quite similar to the auditing standard, as the judgments involved are based on the information needs of the intended users and not the level of assurance provided. There are various layers involved in the consideration or determination of materiality, which are shown on screen. Firstly, the practitioner's understanding of the entity is important to determine what are the significant elements or aspects of the entity's service performance, which are important to users of the service performance information. Understanding what elements or aspects of service performance are significant to users may assist the practitioner to focus their efforts and apply professional judgment when considering any misstatements identified. Secondly, the practitioner determines and documents materiality considerations and/or materiality to determine the nature, timing, and extent of review procedures, and to determine, it's a mouthful as well, and to determine the assurance practitioner's tolerance for misstatement. Here, the practitioner documents the factors relevant to their consideration of materiality for qualitative service performance information, so that's your words, and the basis for determination of materiality for quantitative service performance information. So that's figures, numbers, dollars, and so on. In the next slide, we'll have a look at some of these factors. For service performance information, there is unlikely to be an overall materiality, as for example, there's unlikely to be a common unit of account. Then, further down, the assurance practitioner applies materiality when assessing the appropriateness and meaningfulness of the service performance information, so those significant elements or aspects of service performance and related material performance measures and or descriptions. And the assurance practitioner also applies materiality when assessing the individual or collective misstatements. Although individually a misstatement might not be material, collectively they might amount to a misleading portrayal of the entity's service performance. So here's some of the factors an assurance practitioner may consider for when they are determining materiality for service performance or the tolerance for error. So first up, proximity to purpose. So how important is the element to achieving the entity's service performance objectives? If it's focused on the entity's primary purpose, then the auditor may have a less tolerance for error. Presentation. How has the service performance information been presented? For performance measures that have been given a full page in the performance report, the auditor may have a lower tolerance for error. Extent of interest. For example, does the service performance measure relate to a key stakeholder such as a funder? And does the measure cause the funder to increase or decrease their funding? Another factor is economic, social, political, and environmental effects. Is there a high level of wider societal interest? For example, water quality. When there is a significant risk to the public, the practitioner may have a lower tolerance. Number of persons affected, that may also impact the practitioner's tolerance for error. Same with, does the measure relate to a target? Whether the target was previously disclosed or how close the measure is to the target may impact the practitioner's tolerance for error. If the reported result is close to the target, the practitioner may have a low tolerance for error as well. Just finishing off on the section of materiality, when our working group was working on the revised auditing standard for service performance information, they spent a lot of time discussing materiality due to its complex nature and a real desire by the group to explain it as simply as possible. Someone in the group said that when they think about materiality for service performance information, they think of it like this. So firstly, which elements or aspects of service performance are most important to users? Secondly, what are the material performance measures and or descriptions in those significant elements? And then thirdly, what is my tolerance for a misstatement for those material performance measures and or descriptions? So this succinct and clear description of how to approach materiality was included in the standard and also in the review standard. In an audit, the auditor undertakes a risk assessment and responds to those assessed risks. In a review, the practitioner will undertake the steps in paragraphs 30 and 31. At paragraph 30, the practitioner uses the understanding obtained to identify areas where material misstatements are likely to arise, and therefore provides a basis for designing procedures to address those areas. Following this, the practitioner responds to those areas where material misstatements are likely to arise, as Lisa will now discuss.
Thanks, Bruce. So paragraph 31 is another one of those key areas of difference in work effort between an audit and a review. So in that, the assurance practitioner is to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence through inquiry, analytical procedures, and if judged by the practitioner to be necessary in the circumstances, other procedures. So the inclusion of other procedures is not to imply a greater level of work effort than, say, the review for historical financial information. But it's to recognise that due to the nature sometimes of service performance information being qualitative, analytical procedures may not be appropriate to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. However, due to that connectivity between financial and service performance information, many instances inquiry analytical may still be sufficient. So we got feedback on this area as well in the consultation, and it was that it wasn't clear when other procedures would be necessary. Therefore, we made amendments into the final standard that the other procedures are required when it's judged by the assurance practitioner as necessary in the circumstances, and that it's due to the nature of some service performance information that analytical procedures may not be appropriate. An example of this that I was thinking about was where the assurance practitioner may use other procedures could be, say, for the inspection of documents when there's a qualitative disclosure that's, say, a client anecdote. So now moving on to the final phase of the engagement reporting. So what I've done here is I've included an example of a conclusion, and you'll see that that's the standard wording that you're used to at the top about nothing coming to the attention of the assurance practitioner. But it's actually concluding on both whether the information is appropriate and meaningful, which is that step one, and then prepared in accordance with the measurement basis or evaluation method selected by the entity in accordance with the financial reporting framework. So that's step two. So just a reminder, so the application for the standard is for accounting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2026. However, it's important to note that early adoption is permitted. And once mandatory, 3000 will not be applicable for review engagements of service performance information. So it's time now to think about what you may need to implement for this new standard. And it'll be things such as updating your templates, updating the firm's methodology, for example, and staff training. And I just wanted to finish off today by actually saying that we are aware that there are a number of challenges around reporting and assurance of service performance information. And the External Reporting Board has been proactive in addressing these challenges and has an active project to support both the preparation and the assurance of service performance information. And this includes the development of some guidance on assurance, in particular around obtaining appropriate evidence. And we will be consulting with users, preparers, and practitioners on these challenges. So that takes us to the end today of our formal webinar. We just have finished a bit early, so we've got room for questions if you'd like to pop any questions into the Q&A. Otherwise, we've got on this slide here how you can contact us if after you've had a chance to absorb this presentation and have a bit of think if you've got any further questions. Bruce, are there any questions in the chat at the moment?
No, there's not, Lisa.
No? Okay. All right then, well, we'll wrap up today if there's no questions in the chat. But wanted to thank you all for joining us today. And like I say, our contact details are on this presentation, and you will receive a copy of this recording and the slides later on. Thank you very much for joining us.